The morning air was thin and cold, the kind that clung to your skin before the sun fully decided to show itself. A pale fog hovered low over the company parking lot, drifting lazily between rows of polished sedans and luxury SUVs that still gleamed from yesterday's detail jobs. Daniel Brooks pushed his janitor's cart slowly across the asphalt. At 43, Daniel moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned not to draw attention. His uniform was clean but worn, the blue fabric faded at the elbows. His shoulders were broad, slightly stooped, not from weakness, but from years of carrying more responsibility than most people ever noticed. He stopped beside the far corner of the lot. There it sat, a 1979 Chevy Nova. The paint was chipped and dull, sun-bleached into uneven patches of gray and blue. Rust traced the edges of the wheel wells like scars that had never quite healed. Next to the sleek, modern vehicles surrounding it, the car looked out of place, almost embarrassing. Daniel didn't see it that way. He saw history, memory, promise. He reached into his pocket as his phone vibrated. A message from Ethan. "Don't forget today, Dad. Science fair. I worked really hard." Daniel's lips curved into a small, tired smile. "I won't," he typed back. "I'm proud of you." He slipped the phone away and glanced at his watch. Plenty of time. Just another shift. Just another morning. Voices echoed across the lot. Laughter, sharp, confident, careless. Daniel looked up as the glass doors of the building opened. The CEO, Laura Mitchell, stepped outside with a group of investors. Their tailored suits stood in stark contrast to the chill air, expensive shoes clicking against the pavement as they walked. One of them slowed, pointing toward the Nova. "What's that junk doing here?" The words landed casually, almost playfully. Laughter followed, light, effortless. Daniel felt it anyway. Not anger, not shame. Just a familiar tightening in his chest. He kept his head down, fingers curling briefly around the handle of his cart. Years ago, comments like that might have stung. Now they passed through him like wind, noticed but never allowed to stay. He had learned something important over time. People rarely look past the surface, and he had stopped expecting them to. Daniel reached into his pocket again, his keys cold in his hand. The Nova didn't look like much. He knew that. What no one else in that parking lot knew, what no one had ever bothered to ask, was that beneath that chipped paint and rusted steel, something extraordinary was waiting. And before the day was over, the silence of that parking lot was going to mean something very different. The laughter didn't last long, but it didn't need to. It lingered in the air long after the investors moved on, trailing behind them like exhaust fumes. Daniel stayed where he was, hand resting on the handle of his cart, eyes lowered, not in submission, but in habit. Years ago, he might have said something, a sharp comment, a dry joke, a reminder that people shouldn't talk that way. Years ago, he still believed it mattered. Now he simply waited until they disappeared into the building, the glass doors swallowing their voices, their confidence, their careless assumptions. A security guard passed by and gave Daniel a sympathetic nod. "Rough crowd this morning." Daniel shrugged. They didn't mean anything by it. They always meant something by it, just never enough to feel responsible. He pushed his cart forward, wheels squeaking softly as he made his way toward the maintenance entrance, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, wiping fingerprints off glass walls no one noticed unless they were smudged. Invisible work for invisible people. And that was fine. Daniel had made his peace with that a long time ago. As he worked, his mind drifted. Backward, the way it sometimes did when he was tired. Back to conference rooms filled with whiteboards and schematics. Back to long nights arguing for ideas no one wanted to risk their bonus on. Back to being told politely, professionally, that he was promising, but not essential. He shook the thought away and focused on the present, focused on Ethan. The science fair. Daniel pictured his son hunched over the kitchen table, tongue pressed between his teeth, carefully aligning wires and cardboard panels. Ethan had inherited his curiosity, his stubborn need to understand how things worked. That was the one thing Daniel refused to let go of. The idea that curiosity mattered. His phone buzzed again. "Bus is early today," Ethan texted. "Can I meet you at work?" Daniel paused, rereading the message. A flicker of concern crossed his face, quickly followed by a smile. "Yeah," he replied, "I'll be outside." He glanced back toward the far corner of the lot, where the old Chevy Nova sat quietly among the expensive cars. Same chipped paint, same rusted edges, same secret waiting under the hood. Daniel didn't know why his chest felt tight again, only that something about today felt different. Like the calm before a moment that changes everything. Daniel waited near the edge of the parking lot, the hum of the building behind him and the steady traffic beyond the fence. He checked his watch again, not because he was late, but because time had become something he measured carefully these days. Time was the one thing he could never afford to waste. As he stood there, memories crept in uninvited. There had been a version of his life where mornings started in conference rooms instead of parking lots, where his hands held markers, not mop handles, where his name was printed on project proposals and patent drafts instead of stitched onto a faded uniform. Back then, Daniel Brooks was an engineer, a good one. He remembered the first time he presented his hybrid engine concept, clean, efficient, durable. He had believed in it with the stubborn confidence of someone who had done the math 100 times. The room had been full of nods and polite smiles. Then came the hesitation. Too risky, too expensive, not the right time. Each rejection had been delivered with professional courtesy, which somehow made it worse. They didn't say he was wrong. They just said he wasn't worth betting on. Then Ethan was born, and suddenly risk meant something different. When his wife left 2 years later, the world narrowed to school drop-offs, grocery lists, late-night fevers, and bills that didn't care about innovation. Engineering demanded long hours, travel, weekends he could no longer give. So Daniel chose not the career, not the recognition. He chose his son. The janitor job wasn't a step down in his mind. It was a lifeline. Stable hours, health insurance, nights at home. He traded ambition for presence, and he never regretted it. Still, some nights after Ethan fell asleep, Daniel stood alone in the garage staring at the Chevy Nova, tools in hand, blueprints spread across the workbench. That part of him never disappeared. It just learned to wait. A yellow school bus rounded the corner. Daniel straightened, his past fading back into place as the present pulled him forward. The doors hissed open, and a familiar small figure stepped down, backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Ethan spotted him and waved. In that moment, every choice Daniel had ever made felt quietly, undeniably right. That night, after dinner, dishes were stacked and Ethan's bedroom light clicked off. The apartment fell quiet. The kind of quiet Daniel knew well. Soft, fragile, earned. He stepped into the garage behind their building and flipped on a single overhead bulb. It hummed before glowing to life, casting a warm circle of light over the Chevy Nova. Up close, the car looked even rougher. Scratches, faded chrome, rust creeping like ivy along the seams. To anyone else, it was a relic waiting to be hauled away. To Daniel, it was a canvas. His father's voice echoed faintly in his memory. She's got good bones. Don't give up on her. Daniel rolled up his sleeves and lifted the hood. That was where the truth lived. Clean lines, custom fabricated components, wiring laid with meticulous care, a hybrid propulsion system designed for efficiency, durability, and balance. Every choice intentional, every part earned through long nights and quiet persistence. This wasn't a hobby, it never had been. 6 years earlier, Daniel had started with sketches on scrap paper after Ethan fell asleep. Then came simulations on an aging laptop, followed by hand-machined parts bought with overtime pay and careful budgeting. Every setback forced him to slow down, rethink, improve. Failure had taught him patience. Working alone meant there was no applause, no deadline pressure, no shortcuts. Just honesty. If something didn't work, it wasn't hidden behind a meeting or explained away by buzzwords. It simply didn't work, so he fixed it. Night after night, Daniel rested a hand on the engine block, feeling the faint warmth from the day's drive. He hadn't built this for recognition. He hadn't built it for money. He built it because the idea wouldn't let him go, and because he wanted Ethan to grow up knowing that good ideas didn't die just because the world wasn't ready for them. He closed the hood gently as if sealing a promise. Tomorrow the car would sit in the same parking lot. People would walk past it without a second glance. Some would laugh, some would judge. That was fine. They didn't need to see what was underneath. Not yet. The next morning came faster than Daniel expected. By the time he and Ethan reached the company parking lot, the fog had lifted, replaced by a pale winter sun that reflected off rows of polished cars. Ethan hopped out of the Chevy Nova, backpack slung too loosely over one shoulder, eyes wide with curiosity. "This is where you work?" he asked, looking around. "Yeah," Daniel said, locking the car. "Just for a little while." They hadn't taken more than a few steps when voices carried across the lot again. Confident, amused, unmistakably adult. A small group stood near the building entrance. Suits, laughter, the same people from yesterday. Ethan noticed the Chevy before Daniel could stop him. "Why are they laughing?" Ethan asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. "They're not laughing at anything important." Ethan frowned, studying the car, then the people, then his father. Children notice things adults learn to ignore. One of the investors glanced over and smiled, a friendly but distant expression. "That your car, buddy?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, my dad built the engine." The man chuckled softly. "That's a cool hobby." Daniel felt the familiar urge to redirect, to protect the moment from becoming awkward. Ethan, but Ethan didn't stop. "It's not a hobby," he said, earnest and certain. "He designed it. It's really smart. He works on it every night." A few heads turned now, mild curiosity mixed with polite disbelief. To them, it sounded like a child exaggerating. Harmless, charming, easy to dismiss. Daniel knelt slightly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Hey, let's get ready for your science fair." Ethan looked up at him, eyes bright. "Dad, should we show them?" The question landed heavier than Daniel expected. He straightened slowly, heart tightening, not with fear, but with something closer to inevitability. He glanced at the Chevy Nova, then at the people who had already decided what it was worth. For years, silence had been easier. But standing there with his son beside him, so sure, so proud, Daniel felt something shift. "Just for a second," he said quietly, and he reached for the hood latch. The latch clicked softly. Daniel lifted the hood, slow and deliberate, as if he were opening something fragile instead of metal and steel. Sunlight spilled across the engine bay, and the laughter behind him faltered. The engine didn't look old. It looked intentional. Clean lines, precision-fitted components, custom brackets machined with care. Wiring routed neatly, labeled, disciplined. Nothing flashy, nothing improvised. It was the kind of work that didn't ask for attention, only understanding. A few of the investors stepped closer, curiosity replacing amusement. One of them, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and a measured gaze, leaned in. His posture changed. The casual slouch straightened. His eyes sharpened. "This isn't stock," he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "No." The man studied the layout, tracing connections with his eyes, not his hands. "Hybrid assist?" he asked. "Electric integration with regenerative capture?" "Yes," Daniel replied, calm even. A pause followed, not awkward, focused. "Who designed this?" the man asked. "I did." Ethan stood a little taller beside his father. The engineer's brow furrowed. He looked closer now, noticing details others missed. Tolerances, materials, decisions that only came from someone who had failed and corrected 1,000 times. "Can you start it?" he asked. Daniel glanced down at Ethan. His son nodded, barely containing his excitement. Daniel slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine came alive with a smooth, controlled rumble. Deep, steady, confident. No rattling, no hesitation. Just balance. The sound of something that worked exactly as it was meant to. The engineer's face changed. Recognition flickered there, followed by disbelief. He pulled out his phone, scrolling fast, then slower. His fingers stopped. He looked back at the engine, then at Daniel. "This architecture," he said under his breath. "I've seen this before." The parking lot had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to wait. The engineer turned toward the others, voice steady but urgent. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Daniel shut off the engine. He already knew the answer, and for the first time, so did they. The engineer didn't answer right away. He stared at his phone, then back at the engine, then at Daniel, as if his eyes were trying to reconcile two versions of reality that refused to align. Around them, the parking lot had gone unnaturally still. Conversations faded. Footsteps slowed. Even the distant traffic seemed to lower its voice. "This design," the engineer said finally, voice tight, controlled, "isn't experimental." Daniel remained silent. "It's mature," the man continued. "Balanced, efficient, built by someone who understands long-term stress, not just performance on paper." He turned the phone toward the CEO. Laura Mitchell's confident expression wavered as she leaned in. On the screen were technical schematics, lines and annotations Daniel knew by heart. She didn't understand all of it, but she recognized the context. The valuation figure caught her attention. $2 billion. "That's not possible," she said quietly. The engineer shook his head. "It is. Autodyne Systems has been trying to acquire this architecture for months. It's the holy grail of hybrid propulsion. He looked back at Daniel. Where did you get this? Daniel met his gaze. There was no triumph in his eyes, no anger, just honesty. I designed it, he said, 7 years ago. The words landed without force and hit anyway. The engineer inhaled sharply. Daniel Brooks, the patent filing. You're the original author. Laura straightened, color draining from her face. You're saying our janitor... I'm saying, the engineer interrupted gently, that you're looking at the person the industry has been chasing. Ethan gripped his father's hand, feeling the tension without fully understanding it. Laura searched Daniel's face, embarrassed, unsettled. Why didn't you tell anyone? Daniel considered the question. You never asked, he said. Then after a beat, and it didn't matter. A long silence followed. Then Daniel closed the hood. I'm late for my son's science fair, he said calmly. He took Ethan's hand and walked toward the car, leaving behind a circle of people who were only just beginning to understand the weight of what they had laughed at. Daniel and Ethan had almost reached the Chevy when Laura's voice cut through the stillness. Daniel, wait. He stopped, not out of obligation but courtesy. She walked toward him alone now. The investors stayed back, unsure where to stand, their confidence stripped down to quiet unease. Up close, Laura looked different, less composed, more human. I owe you an apology, she said. The words didn't come easily. For what I said this morning, for laughing. Daniel listened, face unreadable. I judged you, she continued. Your car, your job. I thought I understood this place, this industry. I didn't. Daniel glanced at Ethan, then back at her. People make assumptions, he said evenly. It happens. That doesn't make it right, Laura replied. She hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her. Do you know what your design is worth? Daniel nodded. I've been following the filings. You could challenge them, she said. You could change everything. Daniel's voice softened, but his resolve didn't. I already changed what mattered. Ethan shifted beside him, confused but sensing the gravity. Laura exhaled slowly. Then let me be direct. We want to talk. Not here. Not like this. We want to make this right. Daniel studied her for a moment. Her posture, her eyes, the sincerity trying to break through years of corporate armor. Tonight, he said finally, after the science fair. Relief flickered across her face. Thank you. Daniel opened the car door for Ethan, then paused. One thing, he added. This conversation doesn't happen because my work is valuable. Laura frowned slightly. It happens, Daniel said, because people are. He closed the door gently and got in behind the wheel. As the Chevy Nova pulled away, Laura remained where she was, staring at the empty space it left behind. Realizing that the most important lesson of her career hadn't come from a boardroom, but from a man she almost dismissed entirely. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and reheated dinners. Laura Mitchell hesitated outside apartment 3B, adjusting her coat, the polished confidence she wore at work noticeably absent. When she knocked, the sound echoed louder than she expected. Daniel opened the door a moment later, still in his work clothes. He looked tired but calm. Ms. Mitchell, he said. Laura, she corrected quietly. If that's okay. He stepped aside, letting her in. The apartment was small but meticulously kept. A stack of school books on the table. Crayon drawings taped to the fridge. A half-finished science project spread across the counter. It wasn't impressive, but it was alive. Ethan peeked out from his room, curious. Daniel nodded. Homework, buddy. As the door closed, Laura took a slow breath. Thank you for meeting with me. I said I would, Daniel replied, gesturing to a chair. She sat, hands clasped tightly. I didn't come as a CEO tonight. I came as a person who was wrong. Daniel waited. I laughed at you, she said. I laughed because it was easy. Because I was surrounded by people who never questioned it. And I don't want to be that person. Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, honest. You're not here just to apologize, Daniel said. She nodded. No, I'm here because what you built matters, and because how you were treated doesn't sit right with me. She explained the patent conflict, the legal imbalance, the resources Daniel didn't have access to. Then she leaned forward. We can help. Legal support. Protection. A platform to bring your work into the world. Daniel looked down the hallway toward Ethan's room. I won't lose time with my son, he said simply. You won't, Laura replied. Not if we do this right. Daniel met her eyes. Then if we talk about moving forward, we talk about doing it on human terms. Laura nodded slowly, fully. For the first time, she said, that sounds like the right way. Daniel didn't answer right away. He walked to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, and set one in front of Laura. The gesture was simple, unhurried, nothing like a negotiation table. When he sat down again, his posture was relaxed, but his eyes were steady. "If we do this," he said, "we do it on terms that make sense for my life." Laura nodded. "I'm listening." "First," Daniel continued, "my hours don't change. I work 9 to 5. No late nights, no weekends. Ethan comes first." She didn't hesitate. "Agreed." "Second," he said, "I keep creative control. No committee watering down decisions. No rushing something that isn't ready." Laura considered it, then nodded again. "Agreed." Daniel paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Third, Ethan's future is protected. Full scholarship. Any engineering program he chooses." A smile tugged at Laura's lips, not amused but impressed. "That can be arranged." Daniel leaned back slightly. "There's one more." She waited. "Respect," he said. "Not for me, for everyone. Janitors, security, cafeteria staff. No one gets laughed at because of what they wear or where they park." Laura's expression softened. She glanced around the apartment again, as if finally seeing the space for what it represented. "You have my word," she said, "and my responsibility." Daniel studied her for a long moment. He wasn't measuring ambition or confidence. He was measuring sincerity. "Then we can move forward," he said. Laura exhaled, a tension releasing from her shoulders. "You should know," she added. "This will change things." Daniel smiled faintly. "I know." From down the hall, Ethan's voice called out, "Dad, is it okay if I show my volcano model tomorrow?" Daniel stood. "Absolutely, buddy." He turned back to Laura. "That," he said quietly, "is the only thing that really matters." And for the first time, Laura understood that this partnership wasn't being built on innovation alone, but on priorities she had never learned to name. The announcement went out quietly at first. An internal email, a short press release, no dramatic headlines, just a name and a title that made people read twice. Daniel Brooks, Chief Engineer, Hybrid Systems Division. Whispers followed, then questions, then disbelief. Employees who had walked past Daniel for years now paused, unsure how to greet him. Some apologized awkwardly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Daniel noticed it, but he didn't correct them. He just kept showing up the same way he always had. On time, focused, calm. The project moved fast, but never recklessly. Daniel worked with precision and patience, refusing shortcuts that would compromise integrity. When deadlines tightened, he didn't raise his voice. He explained. He listened. And people followed. Because they trusted him, Ethan's science fair came and went without fanfare. Daniel stood at the back of the gym, hands in his pockets, watching his son explain a hybrid engine model with quiet confidence. "First place." Ethan ran to him afterward, eyes shining. "You taught me that," he said. Daniel hugged him. "You taught yourself." At work, the culture began to shift. Small things at first, names remembered, jokes reconsidered, respect extended where it hadn't existed before. Laura noticed. So did everyone else. Despite the success, Daniel didn't move. The apartment stayed the same. So did the Chevy Nova in the parking lot, its paint still chipped, its presence still modest. When someone finally asked why he hadn't replaced it, Daniel smiled. "It still works," he said, "and it reminds me where I came from." That answer spread faster than any press story, because people realized something then. Daniel Brooks hadn't changed when the world started seeing him. The world had simply caught up. A year later, the museum was quieter than Daniel expected. Families drifted through the wide halls at an unhurried pace, voices lowered out of instinct. In the center of the main exhibit stood a glass case, softly lit. Inside it rested a familiar form, sleek, compact, purposeful, the engine. A small plaque beneath it read, "The Brooks Hybrid System, designed by Daniel Brooks." Ethan stood frozen in front of the display, eyes wide, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Dad," he whispered, as if speaking louder might break something. "That's yours." Daniel nodded. "Ours." A nearby father read the plaque aloud to his daughter. "Built in a garage by a single father while working as a janitor." The girl tilted her head. Why was he a janitor if he was that smart? The man hesitated. "Because sometimes life asks people to choose responsibility over recognition." Daniel smiled, not because he felt proud, but because he felt understood. Later, as they walked back to the parking lot, the Chevy Nova waited exactly where it always had. Same faded paint, same rusted edges, same quiet confidence. Ethan glanced at it, then back at the museum doors. "They used to call it junk," Ethan said. "They did," Daniel replied. But it wasn't, Ethan said, not a question. No, Daniel said gently, it never was. Daniel opened the door and let his son climb in. As he settled behind the wheel, he thought about how many times he'd been overlooked, how many ideas had been dismissed because they didn't look impressive enough, how many people were still out there, building something meaningful in silence. The engine started with its familiar, steady hum. Before pulling away, Daniel looked at Ethan. Let me ask you something. Ethan looked up. Okay, what do you think would have happened if I'd stopped building just because people laughed? Ethan thought for a moment. Then they would have been right. Daniel nodded. Exactly. And then he thought of the people listening to this story, the ones watching, wondering if their effort mattered, if their work unseen was worth anything at all. So here's the question for you. How many incredible ideas have we missed because we judged too quickly? How many people have we underestimated because of what they wore, where they worked, or what their life looked like on the surface? And if you're building something quietly right now, will you keep going even if no one is watching yet? Because value doesn't disappear just because it goes unnoticed. And the future is often being built by the people no one thinks to look at twice. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of someone you know, or maybe reminded you of yourself, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join a community that believes real talent doesn't need polish to shine. It just needs a chance to be seen. Sometimes the person driving the future home is the one everyone else called junk. And sometimes that person is you.